They thought they could humiliate me with a single slip of paper, one bright yellow citation taped smugly to the curb, and my old Ford pickup vanished into a towing yard without warning. To the HOA, it was just an unauthorized vehicle. To me, it was the last piece of my father. I still had the truck we'd rebuilt together, bolt by bolt, before he passed. Every dent was a memory, every weld a story. And they ripped it away like trash, cluttering their view. But here's the thing about arrogance, it blinds you. Those shiny SUVs lined up in their precious clubhouse lot. They were sitting on land that didn't even belong to them. My family's land. And once I remembered the dusty deed tucked away in my cabinet, the HOA's fate was sealed. They thought they could tow my truck. I was about to tow away their entire parking lot. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where all of you are watching from around the world. The day I came home from that weekend trip, the air felt unusually still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Gravel crunched under my boots as I pulled into my driveway, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The space where my truck should have been sat empty, a scar of oil stains marking the ground like a ghost. My chest tightened. At first I thought maybe my brother had borrowed it, or maybe the old engine had finally betrayed me, and some good-hearted neighbor pushed it away for repairs. But no. My eyes caught the glint of plastic fluttering in the breeze. There it was. Laminated of all things, like a smug badge of authority that would outlast the rain, a bright yellow HOA citation taped to the curb. My eyes locked onto one word, written in bold, unauthorized. That single word seared into my mind. Unauthorized. Like my existence didn't belong. Like the memories tied to that truck weren't worth a second thought. The notice claimed my vehicle had been removed in accordance with community guidelines. Community. I nearly laughed at the irony. I didn't even live inside their iron-gated subdivision with its manicured hedges and fountains. My land sat just outside their property line, a modest 2 acres, with a gravel drive that happened to run parallel to their clubhouse parking lot. Apparently the sight of my old F-150, sun-faded and dented but sturdy as hell, offended their delicate suburban sensibilities. Without a knock on my door, without a phone call, they dragged it away like it was an eyesore. My stomach dropped as I dialed the number listed at the bottom of the notice. Each ring tightened the coil of anger in my gut. A gruff voice at the towing yard confirmed my worst suspicion. Yes, they had the truck. Yes, it was ordered by the HOA president personally. Yes, if I wanted it back, I'd better show up with $1 200 inches cash. Cash only. I slammed the phone so hard against the counter that the cord rattled in its socket. For a second, I could hardly breathe. This wasn't about a truck. This was about my father. That F-150 was the last project we ever worked on together. My father's fingerprints lived in every weld along the frame. He'd guided my clumsy teenage hands as I learned to sand rust, fit gaskets, and tighten bolts. After he passed, every drive I took in that truck felt like he was still riding shotgun, his presence rumbling in the engine. And the HOA, with all their smug rules and community standards, had decided my father's memory was unworthy of their view. I scraped together the money, cashing out savings I'd been building for months, and drove across town to retrieve the truck. The towing yard was a graveyard of dented sedans and impounded SUVs, but seeing my old Ford chained behind a chain-link fence hit me like a gut punch. I paid the fee, signed the release, and drove her home, but the anger didn't fade. If anything, the rattling of the loose muffler on the way back made the rage grow louder. When I pulled into my driveway that night, I didn't go straight inside. I walked past the house, past the mailbox, across the gravel, and right up to the edge of the HOA's precious clubhouse. Their lot was lit up like a football field, tall white lamps casting sterile halos over rows of polished luxury cars. BMWs, Audis, Mercedes lined up like some showroom display of suburban vanity. I stood there in the shadows, invisible, boiling. That's when I noticed something odd, something they had clearly taken for granted for years. Their overflow parking lot, this gleaming symbol of their status, sat on a corner lot that didn't quite align with the rest of the subdivision. It sat on land that had always looked familiar. And then it hit me. Memories came rushing back of my grandfather sitting on our porch telling stories about the old days. He'd once mentioned how decades ago the county had cut a temporary deal with the HOA to allow access for a parking lot. But the deed itself, he'd sworn, had never left our family's name. My grandfather had refused to sell, refused to sign anything permanent. At the time, I hadn't paid attention. But now, standing in that fluorescent glow, the memory clicked into place. Could it be true? Had they really built their entire parking lot on my land? I hurried back to the house, heart pounding harder than it had in years. I dug through filing cabinets, stacked with old tax returns and family papers, dust choking my throat as I rifled through folders. And there it was, just where my father had left it, the original deed. Yellowed paper edges curling but still official. My family's name stamped across the top in fading ink. I held that document like it was a weapon. Because it was. That night I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities. The HOA had humiliated me. They'd taken from me without remorse. But if the land under their precious overflow lot was truly mine, then I held the kind of power they couldn't even begin to imagine. For the first time all day, the anger settled into something else. Not peace, not yet, but a cold, sharp resolve. The next morning, I ironed a shirt, something I rarely bothered with, and marched into the county records office. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman behind smudged glasses, barely glanced up as I slapped the deed on the counter. She asked for parcel numbers. I gave them. She asked for proof of inheritance. I had that too, notarized and sealed. Step by step, the puzzle pieces clicked into place. By the time I walked out of that building, the ball was in motion. Paperwork filed, signatures stamped, a legal process that could not be undone. All I had to do was wait 30 days for the county's review. 30 days. That was nothing compared to the years of arrogance the HOA had inflicted on everyone around here. 30 days, and their smug parking empire would crumble. I spent those weeks driving past the lot every evening just to watch. SUVs gleamed under their lamps, tennis players strolled to their matches, brunch crowds spilled from the clubhouse. None of them had the faintest clue that beneath their wheels, beneath their heels, every inch of asphalt belonged to me. The more I thought about it, the more delicious it became. They had called my truck unauthorized, but soon every car parked in that lot would be the unauthorized one. And when the county finally stamped the paperwork approved, I swear I could hear my father's laughter echo in the wind. When the county's approval letter finally arrived, I tore the envelope open at my kitchen table, hands trembling, coffee sloshing dangerously near the edge of the mug. The document was simple, a few sentences in bureaucratic language, but to me it read like a victory anthem. The land in question was confirmed under my ownership. The parking lot that the HOA had paved, striped, and polished as their crown jewel legally, every inch of it belonged to me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of it settle. For weeks, anger had been the fire in my chest. But now it was something colder, more calculated. I wasn't going to let this slide with just a smug grin. They had stolen something personal from me, desecrated a memory of my father, and demanded money for the privilege. They wanted a war of paperwork and rules. Fine. I was about to give them one. That night, I drove past the clubhouse again. The lamps buzzed, moths swarming in the pale light. SUVs gleamed freshly waxed, while families in tennis whites laughed and sipped water bottles. It was a perfect snapshot of arrogance. And none of them knew that within days their shiny little haven would collapse into chaos. I spent the next morning making calls. Not to lawyers, not yet. To contractors, fencing companies, sign makers. One guy named Miller, a grizzled Vietnam vet who now ran a fencing crew out of a battered pickup, answered my call with a gravelly voice. Chain link barbed top steel posts. You want it up fast, I can do it. Cash talks. His words sounded like music. Friday night, I told him. Be ready. I want the whole thing sealed off by sunrise. Miller chuckled like he'd been waiting for someone to hand him a job with that kind of bite. In the days leading up to it, I couldn't resist poking around deeper. I filed a Freedom of Information request for the HOA's permits, their maps, their so-called community expansions. Turns out the board had been cutting corners for years. Their lot sat half on my land, half on what had been approved as temporary municipal use decades ago. They'd paved over a handshake deal and assumed nobody would notice. Nobody had questioned it until now. By Friday, my plan was polished sharp. I watched from my porch as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, painting the sky in bruised purple. The last of the cars trickled out of the lot as the tennis matches ended, exhaust fumes drifting in the cool evening air. At 10 o'clock sharp, Miller's trucks rolled in headlights off, loaded with posts, rolls of fencing, and signs stenciled in angry red letters. Private property. No parking trespassers towed at owner's expense. We worked under the cover of darkness, the sound of sledgehammers pounding posts into soil ringing like a battle drum. By 3 a.m, the lot was wrapped tight in chain-link signs glaring under the floodlights. I leaned against one of the posts, sweat dripping down my neck, and felt the sweetest satisfaction I'd ever known. My truck was parked proudly inside the fence like a king returned to his throne. When dawn came, the storm hit. By 7 a.m, residents began pulling up for their usual Saturday routines: brunch at the clubhouse, tennis matches, morning yoga. and every single one of them slammed on their brakes when they saw the lot fenced off like a crime scene. SUVs circled like vultures, horns, honking voices rising in frustration. "What the hell?" one man shouted, stepping out of his Lexus in pressed khakis. "Is this some kind of joke?" The clubhouse manager, a wiry guy named Todd with a whistle around his neck, ran out flapping his arms like he could somehow will the fence away. He tugged at one of the signs, his face draining of color when he saw my name, scrawled at the bottom, Owner J. McAllister. By noon, the HOA president himself called me. His name was Gregory Phillips, but around here he strutted like a king. On the phone, though, he was spitting nails. "You can't do this," he barked. His voice was sharp, like he'd been rehearsing it in the mirror. "Oh, but I can," I said calmly, twirling the deed in my fingers like a royal scepter. "And I will until I'm repaid every cent you stole from me, plus damages for harassment." "You're trespassing against the community," he shouted. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. "Greg, you're parked on my property. For years. You built on it, striped it, held parties on it. If anyone's guilty of trespassing, it's you." Silence. For once, Mr. Phillips didn't have a rehearsed speech. That afternoon, they sent 2 board members to negotiate. A woman in oversized sunglasses and a man with a clip-on tie stood on the other side of the fence, trying to look intimidating while swatting at mosquitoes. "We can come to an agreement," the woman said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Funny," I said, leaning against the gate. "That's what I thought when I called about my truck. But instead of talking, you towed it." Her smile cracked. The HOA thought they had power. After all, they had lawyers, fines, citations. But I had something stronger: land law and leverage. By Sunday morning, the chaos had reached fever pitch. Residents were parking on side streets, blocking driveways, cramming their luxury cars into muddy ditches. A neighbor told me she saw one Mercedes bottom out on a tree root. Children in tennis whites trudged across the street, their shoes stained with grass. The HOA board scrambled to hire a lawyer, sending me pompous emails threatening lawsuits. But every time I replied with a copy of the deed attached with a smiley face emoji. That night I poured myself a whiskey on the porch and listened to the sound of honking cars echo through the subdivision. For the first time in years, I felt vindicated. My father's truck sat behind the fence, headlights glinting in the moonlight like it was watching the revenge unfold. But this was just the beginning. The HOA thought this was about a parking lot. They had no idea I was about to turn their world upside down. By Monday morning, the HOA board was in full-blown panic. Word had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood Facebook groups, each post more dramatic than the last. "Parking lot stolen," one headline screamed, as though asphalt could simply vanish. Another resident uploaded photos of the chain-link fence, tagging it with hashtags like #HOChaos and #unauthorized parking. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the one controlling the narrative, and that terrified them. I stood at my window, sipping black coffee, scrolling through the chaos on my phone. Each angry post was a victory lap. They wanted to call me a nuisance, a vandal, a petty neighbor. But the truth was simple. I owned the ground they had been exploiting for years. That afternoon, Phillips showed up at my driveway in a tailored gray suit, his tie yanked loose from the humid air. He strutted up like he still owned the world, but the sweat stains under his arms betrayed him. "McAllister," he snapped, "this stunt of yours has gone too far. The community is furious. You've embarrassed the board. This has to stop." I leaned against my old truck, arms crossed, deliberately casual. "Funny. You didn't think it was too far when you dragged my truck off without warning. Didn't mind humiliating me, did you?" He waved a dismissive hand like brushing away a fly. "That was different. Your vehicle was unauthorized." I cut him off with a laugh so sharp it made him flinch. "Unauthorized. That word doesn't mean what you think it does, Greg. You want unauthorized. Every single car in your precious parking lot is unauthorized. And I've got the paperwork to prove it." I pulled the deed from my back pocket, flicking it open with exaggerated flair. His eyes darted to the seal recognition flickering in his expression before he quickly masked it with arrogance. "We'll fight this in court," he said. "The board has attorneys who specialize in property disputes. You won't win." I grinned. "Then you better tell those attorneys to pack a lunch, because this is going to be a long fight, and I've got time." He left in a huff, tires screeching as he pulled away. But I could feel it, the ground under him was crumbling. That evening I dug deeper. If the HOA wanted a legal battle, I was going to arm myself to the teeth. I contacted a young attorney named Sarah Whitman, fresh out of law school, but with a reputation for chewing through red tape like a buzzsaw. When I handed her the deed, her eyes lit up. "They built an entire lot without securing the transfer," she asked, disbelief lacing her voice. "That's a gold mine. Trespassing, unlawful development, misuse of public easement, this isn't just a mistake. This is negligence. Can I really hold them accountable? I asked. Sarah smirked, her pen tapping against the table. Not only can you hold them accountable, but you can make them bleed money for every day they resist. This case isn't about a truck anymore, it's about power. And right now you're holding the grenade with the pin pulled. I couldn't help but laugh. For the first time, someone else saw the bigger picture the way I did. Within days, Sarah had drafted a cease and desist letter on crisp letterhead stamped with her firm's seal. We sent copies directly to the HOA board, the county, and the local paper for good measure. In it, she laid out the facts with surgical precision. The lot sat on land that belonged to the McAllister family. The HOA had knowingly built on unauthorized property. Continued use would constitute trespassing and unlawful enrichment. When the letter landed, the board lost its collective mind. Angry calls poured in. Neighbors drove by my property, slowing down to glare as if I'd stolen their birthright. Phillips even tried to rally residents into staging a peaceful protest outside my gate, but only a dozen people showed up, waving hand-painted signs that looked more like a high school art project than a revolution. One said, "We need parking." Another read, "Think of the children." I leaned against my fence with a beer in hand, watching them shout into the hot Sunday. The longer they stood there, the redder their faces grew until finally they slunk home defeated. Meanwhile, the real cracks began to show. The clubhouse manager, Todd, resigned within a week, citing stress and hostile working conditions. Tennis tournaments were canceled due to lack of parking, sparking outrage among the wealthier residents who considered Saturday doubles sacred. Local businesses complained about blocked traffic from cars lining the streets. Even the mail carrier cursed under his breath when SUVs clogged the curbs. It was a slow, delicious unraveling. One evening, Sarah and I sat on my porch going through the next steps. She pointed to a section of the law book she'd brought. Here's the thing, she said. If they try to bulldoze their way through this with permits or retroactive deals, they'll still be on the hook for damages. You have them cornered. If they were smart, they'd cut you a check right now and beg for a lease. I nodded, sipping my whiskey. And if they're not smart, her smile turned sharp. Then we bury them in court until they can't afford to breathe. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA loved to bury residents in endless rules and fines. Now the tables had turned, and they were the ones drowning in paperwork and penalties. By the end of the month, cracks in their unity spread. Some board members wanted to settle quickly, whispering about liability insurance. Others, Phillips especially, wanted to double down, convinced they could intimidate me into submission. But every threat they threw, I parried with facts, deeds, and Sarah's airtight logic. The more they fought, the weaker they looked. And through it all, my truck sat proudly inside the fence, its dented body glowing in the Sunday. Every time I walked past, I could almost hear my father's voice. "Don't let them push you, son. You stand your ground." So I did. And I was just getting started. The HOA thought 30 days of red tape would slow me down, but what they didn't realize was that patience had never been my weakness. I grew up fixing trucks with my father, waiting hours for grease to dissolve bolts, to loosen engines, to hum back to life. Waiting was part of the process, and I had no problem letting time work in my favor. The difference was that now, every day that ticked by wasn't eating away at me, it was tightening the noose around their necks. When the county clerk stamped that final approval on my claim, the legal transfer was as official as gravity itself. That deed wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a weapon. The land beneath their prized parking lot wasn't theirs, and the moment I realized the magnitude of that, my anger melted into something sharper: strategy. I spent the first week of my official ownership in what most would call boring paperwork. To me, it was war prep. Filing notices of trespass, recording land boundaries with the county, cross-referencing HOA maps against old municipal easement records. Each document I uncovered painted the same picture the HOA had overreached for decades, assuming that wealth and arrogance could stand in for legality. They'd paved over family history and turned it into asphalt, and nobody had ever challenged them. Until me. One morning I drove down to the county office again, the deed in one hand and a black coffee in the other. The clerk, a gray-haired man named Dennis, who had seen every dispute under the sun, leaned forward when he saw my file. "McAllister land, huh? Haven't heard that name in a while." "Why's that?" I asked. He shrugged. "Your grandfather made waves around here. Never backed down from a fight with the city. Folks said he once blocked a road project with nothing but a tractor and stubborn pride." I smiled. "Guess it runs in the family." Dennis chuckled, stamping the last of my forms. "If your deed is as clean as it looks, the HOA doesn't stand a chance. They'll huff and puff, but the law is on your side." Walking out of that office, I felt lighter. My father and grandfather had fought their battles in their own ways, and now it was my turn. But legal documents were only the beginning. I needed proof that the board understood their position, or rather their lack of one. So I took a little stroll down memory lane, quite literally. Late one evening, I walked the perimeter of the parking lot, tracing each crack in the asphalt with my boots. The lamps buzzed above me, casting shadows like prison bars across the shiny SUVs lined in rows. A part of me almost admired the orderliness, the freshly painted stripes, the flawless blacktop. But admiration soured into something darker when I imagined my truck being hooked and hauled away. Every light they had installed here was just another reminder of their arrogance. I crouched down near the northwest corner of the lot, where the asphalt met the overgrown edge of my land. Beneath the weeds, I found the faint outline of an old stone marker weathered and nearly buried. My grandfather had shown it to me once, decades ago as a boy. Back then, I hadn't understood why he insisted we walk the property lines every spring. Now I understood. He wasn't just teaching me geography, he was teaching me ownership. That marker wasn't just stone. It was evidence. I snapped photos, time-stamped and geotagged them, then forwarded them straight to Sarah, my attorney. Within minutes, she replied, "This is gold, physical boundary evidence. They can't dispute it." I grinned in the dark, brushing the dirt from my jeans. For the first time in years, I felt my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, urging me forward. The next step was less poetic and far more grueling: the courthouse, filing claims, attending hearings. Sitting across the aisle from HOA attorneys who tried their best to look intimidating but kept tripping over their own arrogance. One, a balding man with a shiny forehead, sneered at me as though I were dirt under his loafers. But the moment Sarah pulled out the original deed, stamped and notarized, the sneer twitched into something that looked a lot like panic. "This land has never changed hands," the judge asked, adjusting her glasses. "No, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice smooth as steel. "The McAllister family has held continuous ownership for over 70 years. The HOA has been occupying it without authorization since at least 1991. I didn't need to add anything." The judge's frown said it all. After that hearing, Phillips cornered me in the hallway. His suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie hanging like a noose around his neck. He jabbed a finger at my chest. "You think this makes you some kind of hero? You're tearing this community apart." I leaned closer, lowering my voice until only he could hear. "No, Greg. I think this makes me the guy who finally told you no. And as for your community, maybe it's about time they learned their castle is built on sand." His face turned a shade of red I didn't know humans could reach. He spun on his heel and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. Every encounter like that only fueled me more. Each time they tried to intimidate me, it backfired because I had the truth on my side. And the truth was a weapon sharper than any fine or citation they could throw. But the waiting wasn't over. Court filings take weeks, sometimes months. In the meantime, the HOA continued to unravel. Residents fumed, forced to park blocks away. Local news outlets picked up the story, spinning it into a drama about the lone homeowner fighting the HOA. They painted me as some kind of folk hero, the man who stood his ground against the bullies in khakis. I didn't mind the attention. The more eyes on this fight, the better. Still, the days were long, filled with paperwork, phone calls, and careful planning. It wasn't glamorous. Revenge rarely is not in the middle stages. But every time I felt exhaustion creeping in, I'd step outside and look at that lot. I'd watch the luxury cars circle, confused and frustrated, their owners glaring at the fence like it was a personal insult. I'd see the signs I had posted, "Private property, no parking," flapping in the wind like banners of defiance. And I'd remember the night my truck disappeared, the hollow ache in my chest, the sting of humiliation. That memory kept me going. That memory reminded me that this wasn't about pettiness, it was about dignity. And as the calendar inched forward each day, drew me closer to the moment I would slam the final nail into the HOA's coffin. The paperwork was done. The boundaries were marked. The court was aware. Now all I needed was to pull the trigger. The morning after the hearing felt like the calm before a hurricane. My inbox was full of angry emails, my voicemail full of shouted threats, and my porch full of curious neighbors who wanted to know if I was really going to make them pay. Some brought casseroles out of misplaced sympathy. Others sneered like they were doing me a favor by asking questions. I smiled and waved like a man who had finally learned how to hold his ground. The HOA predictably did not take the courtroom rebuke quietly. They hired a bigger law firm, one with polished logos, intimidating letterhead, and a billing rate that would make a heart surgeon flinch. Their first move was predictable motion for a temporary injunction, trying to force me to remove the fence and restore the peace, while the legal proceedings continued. Their argument was theater-convenient phrases about community hardship, the public benefit of the parking lot, and the children who needed easy access to the clubhouse. Sarah laughed when she handed me the paperwork. "They've got all the drama and none of the law," she said. "An injunction needs a serious risk of irreparable harm." Who's harmed by a little boundary correction? They're entitled egos, maybe. She was right. On paper, the case was thin. But in reality, public pressure can push judges to issue temporary orders just to buy time, and time was their favorite currency. The board's theatrics only galvanized their enemies. Local reporters hungry for a story with a David and Goliath bent started showing up at my driveway. The channel sent a skinny morning anchor with a microphone and a tie that didn't match his shoes. He asked me the same question everyone else wanted to hear: why not work something out? Because I asked for a phone call before they towed my truck, I said into the camera and the mic picked it up. That's all I asked. A knock. A courtesy. Instead, they stripped me of my last memory of my father and charged me for it. The anchor blinked like he wasn't sure whether to be sympathetic or shocked. The clip ran that night. Suddenly my fight wasn't just my fight. It was on the front page of the neighborhood app and 3 local feeds. Under pressure, the HOA tried a new angle smear. Anonymous posts appeared thinly veiled as concerned citizen updates, suggestions that I was trying to extort the community, that I'd used the deed as an excuse for personal gain. Another post claimed my truck is a safety hazard. The board's PR guy, Marcus, a man who believed his LinkedIn endorsements constituted moral authority, started running damage control, peppering the neighborhood with memos and glossy flyers about community unity. It got dirtier. One night, someone tried to cut the chain link at the northwest corner. I was tipped off by Miller, who had stayed near the property part, contractor part Sentry. He'd noticed a van idling late and had taken pictures with his old phone. When I went outside with Sarah and a flashlight, we found the cut neat, professional, like someone had come prepared. Whoever did it didn't account for the motion camera I'd had installed after the towing incident. The footage showed 2 people in hoodies, faces obscured, leaning over the fence with bolt cutters. We took the footage to the sheriff's department. The deputies were polite but honest. It's one thing to vandalize private property, another to be caught on tape. The footage didn't get us arrests right away, but it did something just as important. It scared whoever was behind it into a new kind of quiet. Word spread that the attempt to sabotage the fence had been documented. Suddenly excuses dried up and the late-night sabotage crew stayed home. Marcus and the board tried to frame it as rogue elements, but the damage was done. The narrative of the HOA as a clean, orderly institution started to fray at the edges. Mothers who used to post about bake sales now messaged me privately apologizing for the board's tone. An older neighbor named June, whose lavender bushes I'd once helped prune, dropped off a thermos of coffee with a note. "Thank you for standing up. It matters." Little things like that stuck to my ribs more than any victory in court. The legal back and forth intensified. Sarah filed a counterclaim for trespass and unlawful enrichment. She argued we were owed more than a sanitized return of the land. The HOA had benefited financially from our property for years. Parking fees on leased spaces, events increased property values because of improved amenities, and those benefits should be accounted for. We asked for restitution and a modest figure for the emotional distress of having a loved one's memory treated like an eyesore. Lawyers on the other side choked on their coffee when they read it. They threw back certificate-encrusted replies in legalese, but Sarah's motions were tight-rooted in case law and county code. That's when Phillips made a desperate move. He called me, voice low and bordering on pleading. "We'll cut you a check, 10 grand. Lease it back to us. Keep everyone happy. No one loses." He almost sounded reasonable, and in another life, maybe I would have taken a quieter win and moved on. 10 grand would have patched a lot of holes. I didn't take the bait. 10,000, I said, my voice careful, and a public apology posted to the community board. And you retract every citation issued against my property in the past 2 years. I watched him swallow whatever retort he'd prepared. And you don't get a lease. Not the way you treated me. I let the silence drag. He offered an extra 500 as if it were a generous gesture. I laughed and put the phone down. The offer and the way he thought it would be accepted told me everything I needed to know about their arrogance. They valued convenience more than decency. The board tried other tactics. They floated proposals to buy the property outright at market value, which in HOA terms meant a price engineered by their favorite realtor. They enlisted neighbors to pressure me. A few residents came to my gate hoping to plead their case. Some were genuinely apologetic, others insistent. A woman with 2 toddlers said teary, "We drive so far to the playground." I couldn't ignore human pleas. but I also couldn't let the humiliation of my father's truck be swept under the rug for a parking problem. So, I made a different offer. They could pay $10 0 inches restitution, enough to sting, and they could apply for a temporary permit through the county to lease parking legitimately with transparent accounting and a public record of the fee. Or they could fight it out in court and spend 10 times that amount. Publicly, I framed it as an opportunity to do the right thing. Privately, it was leverage. News coverage kept the pressure on. They interviewed Sarah, who didn't play coy about the legal vulnerabilities the HOA had. They broadcast the deed. They ran before and after photos of the lot with my truck behind the fence. The HOA's PR campaign began to look like a losing fight against reality. Late one night, Phillips texted me blunt and raw. "We'll cut the check. Just sign a temporary agreement for the county to sort. Please." The hustle had deflated him. Behind ego, he was a man who didn't want his name dragged through months of litigation or worse, deposition testimony under oath. The board huddled spreadsheets, open calculators, thumping like war drums. I thought about accepting. 10,000 would stop the constant legalities for a while. It would let people park, possibly even restore some peace. But the memory of that yellow laminated notice still felt fresh in my palm. The thing they called unauthorized had been my father's heart on 4 wheels. I couldn't swap dignity for convenience. When the board's representative finally arrived at my gate with a check and the hollow politeness of the defeated, I did something they didn't expect. I accepted the check, photographed it, and then right there on my porch handed it back with a smile. "No lease," I said. "No apology in a private newsletter. Post it on the main board. Admit wrongdoing. And use that money to fund a neighborhood scholarship in my father's name, so something good comes from what you tried to take." Their faces registered confusion, then relief, then irritation. But when I explained how I wanted the apology framed and how the scholarship would be administered publicly by a small committee, including at least 3 residents who opposed the board's heavy hand, they realized this wasn't about cash, management. This was about accountability. They grumbled, they signed, they posted. The apology was worded carefully. The scholarship was set up as an awkward but public compromise, and the check, ironically, was deposited into an account marked community restitution. The board had bought themselves a reprieve, but not the immunity they'd hoped. When I walked that evening past the fence, my truck's dented flank caught the last light and seemed to glow not from polish, but from something harder, satisfaction tempered with a strange melancholy. I'd gotten more than money. I'd forced a community to look at its own reflection and admit it had been wrong. This battle wasn't over. Lawsuits still lingered, but for the first time in months, I slept without thinking about towing yards at 3 a.m. My fence stood. My truck was home. The neighborhood had been forced to reckon. And maybe that, above everything else, was worth more than the check in my hand. The HOA's apology should have felt like closure, but it didn't. It was sterile, written in corporate tones, scrubbed of any real emotion. "We regret the inconvenience caused by miscommunication and will strive for better practices in the future." Miscommunication. That was the word they chose, as if hauling away my father's truck without warning was the same as a wrong pizza delivery. It wasn't regret, they were simply trying to stop the bleeding. The scholarship they set up in my father's name was real enough, and I'll admit, seeing his name printed in the local paper stirred something in me. But every time I passed the clubhouse and saw the smug faces of Phillips and his crew, I knew the fight wasn't over. They weren't sorry. They were biding their time. Within 2 weeks, they launched a new strategy. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes, glossy, colorful, stamped with the HOA seal. The headline read, "Protect our community from hostile neighbors." And there, in grainy, black and white, was a photo of me standing by my fence, holding the deed like a trophy. They framed me as a rogue landowner, a man who endangered neighborhood harmony. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. They wanted to paint me as the villain for defending my own land. At the next board meeting, open to residents but not outsiders, I heard Phillips try to rile up the crowd. "We cannot allow one man to dictate the livelihood of our neighborhood," he boomed, pointing dramatically at the fence in a slideshow photo. Residents clapped, some booed, others sat stiff and silent. But even in that crowd, cracks were forming. A young couple who had just moved in asked why the board hadn't secured ownership before building. An older veteran, cane in hand, asked why they had the right to tow trucks outside their jurisdiction. Phillips brushed them off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That same week, Sarah forwarded me an email chain she'd intercepted through Discovery. It was between Phillips and Marcus, the PR guy. The words jumped off the screen. "We need to break him. If he won't sell, we make his life so miserable he cracks. Code violations, noise, complaints, whatever it takes." There it was proof that this wasn't just incompetence. It was a deliberate campaign to harass me. I filed it under evidence and smiled. They didn't realize every dirty trick was another nail in their coffin. Sure enough, the complaints rolled in. An inspector came by claiming my fence was 2 inches too high. A county official knocked about unpermitted signage. One morning I even found a note taped to my mailbox. Your gravel driveway is non-compliant with stormwater runoff codes. I laughed until I cried. They were throwing the entire HOA rulebook at me, even though most of it didn't apply outside their gates. But harassment has a funny way of backfiring when your enemy underestimates your resolve. Each time they filed a complaint, Sarah countered with legal precedent, citing chapter and verse from municipal law. Each time they tried to corner me, they exposed their own ignorance. And then came the boldest move yet. On a cloudy Thursday morning, I woke to the sound of heavy engines. Through the curtains, I spotted a crew of men in neon vests, unloading equipment near the fence line. They had backhoe shovels and rolls of caution tape. My stomach clenched. They were going to try to dig. I threw on my boots and stormed outside. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the growl of the engine. A foreman in a hard hat looked up sheepishly. "We've been contracted by the HOA to regrade this lot," said they owned it. I yanked the deed from my back pocket so fast I nearly tore it. "This lot is mine. If you so much as touch that fence, you're trespassing. You'll be personally liable for damages." The man hesitated, looking between me and the HOA representative standing a few feet away. Phillips himself, of course, hiding behind his sunglasses, arms crossed like a mob boss. "Go on," Phillips barked at the crew. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." But the foreman wasn't stupid. He squinted at the seal on my document, then at the growing crowd of neighbors, watching from across the street. "You got proof of ownership." I waved the deed in the air. "Filed with the county. Approved. Stamped. You want to be sued into the dirt? Go ahead and start that backhoe." The crew froze. Phillips cursed his face, twisting into an ugly mask. Finally, with a growl, he told them to pack it up. The backhoe's engine sputtered down. The men loaded their gear, and within minutes they were gone. But the damage to Phillips was done. The crowd had seen everything. Neighbors murmured, some shaking their heads. One woman muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "If he's lying, why won't the county back him up? Why'd they leave?" Phillips stomped away without answering. That night, my phone buzzed with messages from residents I'd never spoken to. "We're tired of his nonsense," one said. "He's been bullying us for years. You just happened to be the first who stood up." Another wrote, "We're voting at the next board election. Maybe it's time for a change." I never asked to be a symbol, but somehow that's what I'd become, the guy who punched the bully in the nose and made the whole neighborhood realize they didn't have to take the hits anymore. Sarah and I doubled down. We filed an official motion for damages, not just the restitution they'd already paid, but compensation for harassment, legal fees, and emotional distress. Sarah explained it like math. Every action Phillips took to intimidate me would now cost him dollars. They wanted war, she said, flipping through case law like it was a weapon catalog. "We'll bill them for every bullet they fired." The irony didn't escape me. For years, the HOA had fined people for petty violations: grass too tall, trash bins left out, fences painted the wrong shade. Now every petty attack they threw my way was turning into a financial liability for them. By midsummer, the lot sat abandoned, my fence, standing tall red warning signs glaring in the Sunday. Cars were still parked on side streets. Residents still grumbled, but the chaos had shifted. It wasn't my problem anymore, it was theirs. And through it all, my father's truck sat proudly behind the fence, its battered hood reflecting the sunset. Every dent, every scratch, every memory was safe. But deep down, I knew Phillips wasn't finished. The man had too much pride to admit defeat. He'd try one more desperate move, and when he did, I'd be ready. Because by then, this wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about every neighbor who had been bullied into silence. It was about proving that arrogance has limits, and sometimes the underdog wins. And when the final strike came, it would be louder, uglier, and more public than anything yet. I almost looked forward to it. By late summer, the HOA's war chest was bleeding dry, and their patience had worn even thinner. Phillips, once the unshakable king of khakis and country club arrogance, now looked like a man perpetually stuck in a losing poker game. His tie was crooked, his hair unkempt, and he'd stopped smiling for the local paper's photographers. But even a cornered animal is dangerous, and I knew his last move would be his boldest. It came on a humid Wednesday morning when I woke to the sound of tires screeching. Out front, a convoy of SUVs had pulled up, all of them bearing the decals of local contractors. Men in vests and helmets piled out, carrying clipboards and muttering about demolition. My stomach sank. This was Phillips's last gamble. I stepped outside, deed in hand. "What's this?" I barked. A stocky man with a mustache cleared his throat. "HOA contracted us to tear down this fence. They've authorized a new lot expansion." I nearly laughed. They can authorize the moon landing if they want. But unless they've somehow rewritten the county deed, this lot isn't theirs. And if you start demolition, you'll be trespassing on my land. The workers glanced at each other nervously. Then, like clockwork, Phillips emerged from the back of a black SUV, sweat beading on his forehead. "Ignore him," he snapped. "He's bluffing. Tear it down." That was my cue. Before they could even start their machines, Sarah pulled up in her sedan, a stack of papers clutched in her hands. She strode across the gravel like she'd been waiting for this scene all her life. "Stop," she commanded, her voice carrying like a whip crack. "I have here a court injunction filed just this morning. Any attempt to alter this property without my client's consent will result in immediate contempt charges." Phillips's face went redder than a stop sign. "You can't." "Yes, we can," Sarah shot back. She thrust the papers into the mustached foreman's hands. "And if you value your business license, you'll put those machines back on the trailers and leave." The foreman scanned the documents, his jaw tightening. Finally, he turned to his crew. "Load up. We're not touching this." Phillips exploded. "I'll sue every one of you." But the crew didn't care. They packed up and drove away, engines rumbling like an army retreating in disgrace. I leaned against the fence, grinning. "You're running out of friends, Greg." That broke something in him. He lunged toward me, finger jabbing the air, spittle flying. "You think you've won. You haven't won anything. You've destroyed this neighborhood. Do you know how many people hate you for this?" I didn't flinch. Maybe they hate me. Or maybe they hate the fact that you built your empire on lies. Either way, I'm not the one on the losing side of a lawsuit. Neighbors had gathered by then, smartphones out recording every second. Phillips realized too late that his meltdown was being documented. He stumbled back, clutching his chest, as though the weight of his own arrogance was finally collapsing in on him. 2 days later, he resigned. Officially, the board cited health reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew he'd been forced out after his outburst went viral online. The clip of him screaming at me racked up thousands of views on the neighborhood app, each comment harsher than the last. Embarrassing, unfit to lead, good riddance. The new board members were less hostile. They invited me to a mediation meeting, which was essentially their way of begging for peace. I attended not because I trusted them, but because I wanted to see the look on their faces. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, the very building that loomed over the now-deserted parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and desperation. One board member, a woman with sensible shoes and tired eyes, spoke first. "Mr. McAllister, the community has suffered greatly. We'd like to propose a lease agreement. Fair compensation, full acknowledgement of your ownership, and no more conflict." I let the silence hang for a moment, savoring their discomfort. Then I leaned forward. "You want to use my land? Then here are my terms. 1. You pay restitution in full for every dollar I lost, plus damages. 2. You publicly admit, not just to me, but to every resident, that you trespassed for decades. 3. You accept that this lot will never again belong to the HOA. You will always be a tenant, never an owner." Murmurs rippled across the table. One man whispered, "That's extortion." I raised an eyebrow. "Extortion is what you did when you stole my truck and demanded $1,200 in cash. What I'm offering is mercy." In the end, they caved. The HOA cut me a check for $10,000, nearly 10 times what they'd stolen from me. They signed a lease agreement so one-sided it might as well have been written in my blood. And when they begged me to make it long-term, I declined. "Month to month," I said. "So every 30 days you'll remember who really owns this land." By autumn, the lot looked different. The fence was gone, but the new signs remained: private property, parking by permission only. And every time I saw their shiny SUVs lined up inside, I smiled. Not because I needed the money, not because I liked the chaos, but because I knew in their hearts they hated the reminder. The HOA board couldn't drive past without seeing my truck parked proudly at the edge of the lot, dents, and all like a scar they couldn't erase. Every scrape, every weld, every ounce of history in that truck was a monument to what their arrogance had cost them. And though they thought they'd won back their lot, the truth was they'd lost something far greater. They lost their power over me. They lost the illusion of invincibility. They lost the belief that nobody could stand up to them. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Phillips driving by, avoiding eye contact. His resignation hadn't stopped him from lurking. He'd see me leaning against the truck, sipping a beer, and his jaw would clench tight enough to crack a tooth. That was my victory. Not the check, not the lease, but the look on his face every time he realized he'd been beaten at his own game. And the best part, I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. The HOA had dug its own grave. I just handed them the shovel. The day the final check cleared, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee staring across at the clubhouse. The lot was busy again, cars filling every space, but it didn't bother me. If anything, it amused me. Because now every single SUV, sedan, and luxury crossover sitting there was parked on my land legally, but only by my permission. The HOA had become a tenant to the very man they once tried to humiliate. And that knowledge, that power was sweeter than any amount of money. Neighbors slowly began treating me differently. Some stopped to wave when they drove by. A few even dropped by with pies or beers, thanking me for standing up to the board. Others still gave me side-eye, clinging to the belief that I had somehow hurt the community. I didn't mind. I hadn't done this for their approval. I'd done it because of my father, and because I wasn't about to let a pack of self-important bureaucrats rewrite the meaning of respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, I parked my father's truck at the very edge of the lot. I positioned it so anyone driving past would see it first thing, a dented, weathered beast among a sea of polished SUVs. To me, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a statement. Later that week, Sarah called me with an update. "The board has formally dropped all harassment complaints," she said, her voice carrying a hint of pride, "and the judge dismissed their injunction attempts as frivolous. They've got no more moves left. Legally, this case is yours." I chuckled. It's been mine since day one. They just didn't know it. But the fight had left scars on the community. The HOA meetings grew tense, residents openly questioning the board's choices, their finances, even their purpose. Elections loomed and whispers spread about replacing the entire leadership. I knew I wasn't the only one who had suffered under their rule. Neighbors with stories of fines for garden gnomes, threats over paint colors, and even penalties for Christmas lights that stayed up too long. My stand had cracked something open, and once people saw the HOA could be beaten, they started dreaming about beating them too. Then came the most ironic twist of all. One Saturday morning, a shiny new banner fluttered at the clubhouse entrance Community Appreciation Day, sponsored by the McAllister Family Scholarship Fund. I nearly spit out my coffee laughing. There it was, my father's name plastered across the very building where Phillips and his cronies had once plotted to crush me. They had turned what began as their punishment into their biggest photo opportunity. I showed up anyway, leaning against my truck as families gathered. People shook my hand, kids asked about the truck's dents like they were battle scars. And when the board president, now a timid woman with a nervous smile, took the microphone to thank the community, she stumbled when she got to the scholarship part. "We owe a special acknowledgement to Mr. McAllister, whose generosity made this event possible." Generosity. That word hung in the air. Not stubbornness, not spite. Generosity. They had to swallow their pride and paint me as the good guy. I almost pitied them. Almost. By autumn, the lot had transformed into something different than it used to be. Yes, cars still filled it on weekends, but the energy was different. Signs at every corner reminded residents property leased, by McAllister family use by permission only. And every month, like clockwork, the HOA sent their lease payment, a reminder that arrogance had a price. Sometimes as I watched them pull in, I'd remember that first day coming home to an empty curb, a laminated yellow notice calling my father's truck unauthorized. I'd remember the rage, the helplessness, the feeling of being small. And then I'd look at what had become of it, a community forced to acknowledge that they couldn't steamroll everyone. Philip still drove by, sometimes his face tight behind the wheel, refusing to look my way. I let him pass without a word. He wasn't worth it anymore. The real victory wasn't humiliating him, it was knowing that every time he glanced at that lot, he'd remember losing it. And I'd remember winning it back. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming respect. About proving that some things, like a father's memory, can't be paved over, fenced in, or towed away. Now, when I lean against my truck at sunset, watching the clubhouse lights flicker on, I feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the quiet kind, but the kind earned through fire, grit, and stubborn refusal to be stepped on. Because in the end, the HOA didn't just lose a parking lot. They lost their illusion of power. And I gained something priceless, the knowledge that when you stand your ground, sometimes the ground itself fights back with you. Looking back, this battle taught me something bigger than deeds and fences. It taught me that people, institutions, even entire boards, will try to take what isn't theirs, your property, your peace, your dignity, simply because they think you won't fight back. And sometimes they're right. Too many people stay silent, thinking it's easier to avoid the hassle. But silence feeds arrogance. What I learned is that you don't need to fight with fists or fury, you fight with persistence, with knowledge, with the truth in your hands. You fight not just for yourself, but for the memory of those who came before you, and for the neighbors who can't fight for themselves. And when you win, you don't just restore what was stolen, you show everyone else that it's possible. So if you've ever felt small against a system that seemed too powerful, remember this story. Stand your ground, hold your line, and never ever let anyone tell you that your worth is unauthorized. If this story struck a chord with you, drop a comment below and share where you're watching from. And if you want more HOA showdowns, more stories of drama, revenge, and justice served cold, make sure to subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.